That's really telling. Three individuals engaged in similar behavior, yet three different reactions. So what is the likelihood that we could see three individuals engaged in similar behavior and they solicit three different reactions, right? The African American woman said that, you know, you don't typically see young white men with burglary tools. So her impression of the white man was that he didn't fit the stereotype, right? She had an idea of who you would see in the park stealing a bike, but the young white man didn't fit it. And her friend said, you don't know if he works for the park, right? And then the African American kid, of course, he gets all kinds of reactions. Folks are taking pictures, calling the police. And then we see a little bit of gender bias with the young lady. Both guys rolled up to her and knew she was stealing the bike, and both offered to help. The last guy gave his resume. He said, I did some time. I can steal it, right? And so what is the likelihood that we could see three individuals similarly situated, engaged in similar behavior, and yet our reactions would be different? That's what we oftentimes see in our systems, is similarly situated individuals treated differently based on race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, identity, those kinds of things. And so this video is very telling as it relates to how we respond and react to people based on physical characteristics and not necessarily the facts. Any thoughts, any comments from the chat window before I move on? All right, let me take a couple things off the table. Christy, you guys are hearing me pretty well? Hearing and seeing me?
Yes, we are, Pastor.
Okay, good, good. I know we had some problems a minute ago, and I wanted to make sure. So let me take a couple things off the table real quick. This is not about the blame game. So as we walk through this data, right, this is not about blaming anyone. This is not about accusing anyone of being a racist. Bias is something all humans suffer with, right? We all have these stereotypic attitudes and ideas and images about people who are different than ourselves. It's not about hatred. Just because you realize you have a specific bias towards or against someone doesn't make you racist. It's not about hatred. It's not a public debate, nor will it be a quick fix or a solution to all of the challenges we face in the work that we do around our family and children. What this is about is letting data drive the conversation. You know, what I always tell folks is, you know, we can measure every reaction that our system has towards families and youth. We can measure it, right? And that data should reveal to us whether or not our system is differentially processing certain groups based on race, socioeconomics, whether it's treating people differently based on gender, right? Let the data drive the conversation. Let the data tell us whether or not we have disparate impact. It's about local-driven solutions. It's about being very intentional in system change. It's about focused system reform. It could be about policy, it could be about practice, but at the end of the day, it's about looking at the data and developing strategic plans and programs with measurable outcomes. Now, for years, the feds have said, address DMC. That last core requirement was to address DMC. And they stayed away from the language of reduce DMC or eliminate disproportionate minority contact for fear of implying quotas, right? But we have to be very intentional in saying that we want measurable outcomes. We want to see the disparities decrease, right? And where there's underrepresentation in positive outcomes, we want to see that underrepresentation increase. So when we look at Tennessee, African Americans are roughly 20% of the population, and Caucasians roughly 8%. And this is black and white because, like in Kentucky, the issue of racial and ethnic disparity is a black and white issue. Hispanics and other minority populations are not experiencing racial and ethnic disparities across our systems. And it appears to be similar in at least the juvenile justice arena in Tennessee. The placement, roughly African Americans are roughly 27% of all placements compared to 73% for Caucasians. So Caucasians are underrepresented in youth children placed with the system versus African American youth who are overrepresented in placement. Statewide, African American children are more likely to enter care than whites, and this is a report presented a couple of weeks ago on a presentation by Dr. Garden. When we look at communities in parts of Tennessee with the largest population, with larger populations of African American children, that disproportionality increases significantly, with the greatest differences being in Davidson County and the Shelby County region. When we think about African American children admitted at higher rates than their representation in the population, in these 5 key Tennessee counties, Davidson County African Americans represent roughly about 47% of the kids who are admitted into placement, and they're only 32% of the population. In Madison County, they're roughly 55% of the kids in placement, and they're only 5% of the population. In Hamilton County, roughly 28% compared to 23% representation in the population. In Knox County, 16% compared to 11%. And then in Shelby County, roughly 76% of the placements in Shelby County are African American youth.
Pastor Palmer?
Yes, ma'am.
We do have a clarification. Are you referring to the placement in foster home?
No, I think this is JJ system, and that can be confusing with Tennessee because one agency has both groups. But I'm pretty sure when Dr. Garden presented this, she was talking about kids placed in out-of-home placements in the JJ system.
Okay, and we do have another question. Why is that?
Why is there disparities?
I'm not sure. It just says why with a question mark.
Yes.
Margaret.
Yeah, and so that would require a deeper dive at each data point. So this initial data presentation is really about identifying where racial and ethnic disparities, disproportionality and racial and ethnic disparities exist. Now, as we go through a process of data analysis and understanding community and community dynamics, then sometimes the disparities exist as a result of the lack of community services. So oftentimes some kids are ushered into the system to get access to certain treatment options, to certain support systems and resources. Other kids in communities where resources are abundant have more community-based and private options when it comes to certain things, especially when it deals with treatment issues. And so without doing a deep analysis of each community and their associated disparities, it could be many things. It's not, I don't always, come to the conclusion that it's a result of bad behavior on the part of system folks. Some of this has to do with the lack of community supports and resources within certain disadvantaged communities. So, but that's kind of a general answer to what we see across the nation in disparities. It's a combination of policy and practice on the part of systems, and then it's also a part of community dynamics and the lack of certain resources.
We also have a comment from Sheila, one of our panelists, who says that these numbers are very telling and we've got to do better.
I agree. Yeah, we looked at a few different sets. We did look at some things on the child welfare side, and yes, very challenging when we look at some preliminary data from other systems within. And the interesting thing about Dr. Garden's presentation is she lacked the ability to access school data. And I think that would be another piece that we need to eventually look at to see what are the referral rates to the youth justice system coming out of your schools. And we've done some comparative analysis here in Kentucky as a result of kids being out of school in COVID-19, and we've seen significant decreases in complaints and the filing of complaints as a result of kids not being in school.
Right. And we also have heard from Sandra that this type of disproportionality is evident in even our earliest institutions. In national studies, preschool boys were expelled 4.5 times the rate of girls, and African Americans were expelled at twice the rate of their non-Black peers, with disparities in suspension even greater.
Oh, yes, yes. Dr. Walter Gilliam of Yale did a piece of research on bias in preschool, and he spoke to that very phenomenon, how at the preschool level, African-American kids are subject to discipline and suspension at a rate 3-4 times that of their white counterparts, and oftentimes perceived to be engaged in problematic behavior when, in fact, researchers have proven that there is no problematic behavior. It's just a response and reaction of the faculty. Disproportionality generally increases with age, and so the older African Americans youth get, the more we start to see the gap, the disparity gap starts to increase. And for youth adjudicated delinquent, the disproportionality is even higher, especially again with more African American children and youth. From 2011 to 2018, Black children were consistently assessed by the Kansas assessment tool to have higher levels of needs, which meant more restrictive placements. And so when we looked at the data from you all's CANS report and how that report classifies kids, which ultimately impact what level of placements, we saw a trend in that Black youth were underrepresented at the lower levels of the CAN assessment, and they moved from low to medium to high risk. They continued to increase as we went from low to high, and we saw the opposite for Caucasian kids. They decreased from low to high. So here's what we're looking at when we look at the CANS report. So when you look at low level, African Americans account for 18%. By the time we get to level 2 or medium, they go up to 27%, and then by the time we get to the level 3 and 4, of course, African Americans are 35%, right? So they continue to increase as we get to the more intense placements, the higher levels of the Kansas assessment, which facilitate more restrictive placements. We see the opposite for Caucasian kids again, and these other groups of minority groups. They decrease from low to high. So Caucasians go from 67% of the low, to down to 63% at the medium, and all the way down to 52% of those who are classified as high level, level 3 and 4. And again, this disparity is significant and important because it influences the types of placements.
Pastor Palmer, we do have a question. What does CANS stand for?
Now, somebody that's involved in the Tennessee Department of Children's Services helped me to get that acronym. They've
I can help you.
Yes,
excuse
please.
me. I can help you. It's the Child and Adolescent Needs Survey.
Gotcha. Yeah. I knew it was one of those assessments that happen at the pre-adjudication phase and determines placements, but I just wasn't sure what the acronym meant. So this is important because if that assessment tool, and many of the folks in the children's services arena have strong feelings that this tool may have bias embedded in it, and so therefore predisposing minority kids to a higher score or causing them to score level 3 and level 4, as opposed to their white counterparts. And so it's important, and they're looking at that tool to determine whether or not there is the potential for biased results. So African American children and youth 10 years of age or older are more likely than white youth, than their white peers, to enter care and be initially placed in congregate care. Now, we have research that suggests that these group home type placements, these congregate care type placements, predispose kids for longer stays in the juvenile justice system. So it's very important. If African Americans are most likely to score higher on the CANs, which predisposes them to be most likely placed in congregate care type facilities, then it's setting them up for repeated trips or involvement with the juvenile justice system. African American youth or African American children move more slowly to permanency in the child welfare system, and that disproportionality increases significantly the longer they remain in care. And we see the same phenomena in Kentucky, that African Americans on average stay in our child welfare system longer, and the longer they stay, the less likely they are to be reunited, and the less likely they are to be adopted. African American children are more likely to be reunified when reunification occurs in your system, which is a good thing. African American children are less likely, however, when reunification does not occur, then they're the group less likely of those kids that don't go back home. They're less likely to leave the system as a result of adoption. Among youth adjudicated delinquent, African American youth are more likely to exit to permanency out of your juvenile justice piece. And then in Davidson County and Mid-Cumberland region, African American children are less likely to leave care to a permanent exit. So they end up remaining in care oftentimes much longer than others, and oftentimes getting to that place of leaving care as a result of turning legal age.
And also, we do have a question. Is this test biased to the African American children?
Again, we've not, at least Tennessee, to my point, and Craig, you might be able to speak to this, but to my point, I don't think they've had a evaluation of the tool as it relates to whether or not it facilitates bias. I know there is some subjectivity in the responses and how they're recorded on the tool. And as a general rule, where there is subjectivity, the potential for bias is greatly increased. And so, so from what I've heard so far from folks who work with this tool, I would tend to say, from my lens, if there's subjectivity in how some of the questions are recorded and scored, then the potential for bias is there. But they've not had an evaluation for bias in the tool that they've shared with me. So here's what we know, and again, the folks from the Tennessee Department of Children's Services confirm this, that many of the kids who come into the system as a result of child welfare issues, childhood trauma, maltreatment, abuse, and neglect, are oftentimes the same kids who cross over into the juvenile justice system. And research tells us that the increased likelihood of juvenile justice involvement to the tune of 55% as a result of childhood trauma. And that childhood trauma increases the likelihood of delinquency by anywhere from 47 to 55%. And if a kid has a history of maltreatment, it increases the likelihood that they will commit a violent offense by as high as 96%. So child welfare involvement is very critical to us hopefully preventing kids from crossing over into our juvenile justice system and now being punished as a result of the manifestations of the trauma inflicted upon them by their parents, and oftentimes compounded by the system's reaction and response. As much as we like to, and we have the systems that we have, and so we have to remove kids when there's a threat of danger and neglect is egregious. We have to take actions to remove them. But as much as we're trying to protect them, we have to be mindful of the fact that that removal in and of itself is an adverse childhood experience. And when that trauma manifests, oftentimes it facilitates juvenile justice involvement.
I do have another question. Is
Yes,
there
ma'am.
any information that would allow insight to the educational impact that takes place while these children are in the system?
Yes, I think that you should be able to look at the data that your education system puts out as far as the success rate of students that are put into these alternative educational environments that are in facilities versus the success of children who stay in traditional school settings, right? The same with alternative programs, right? We can look at the achievement gap from students who are placed in alternative school placements versus those who stay in the traditional school environments and compare the success rate. So I would do my best to try to engage the school system to get at some of this data that reflects whether or not kids are, one, being disproportionately recommended or charged and thereby entering into your juvenile justice system. And then once in the juvenile justice system, what is the educational outcomes compared to those educational outcomes with similar situated kids in the traditional school settings. Outside of engaging the school systems to get at some of that comparative data and analysis, I don't know how you would get to it.
We do have a comment from Bertha. She said it seems that these children need more resources to change these scores and behaviors.
Yeah, I think resource when it comes to disadvantaged communities is always a given. But I think we can look at that, and I always tell folks we got to fix the environment as well. But also we have to look at the reaction of systems to kids who come from disadvantaged communities and disadvantaged populations, because we find that the reaction oftentimes is different even when they're similarly situated in the school setting. So two kids got into a fight, but one comes from a good community and good parents. We typically want to protect that kid from these terrible consequences. A similarly situated kid comes from a bad community and what we may deem to be bad parents. Maybe there's a single parent home situation. And so we don't feel the same need to protect his future from bad consequences. And so sometimes even when similarly situated, it's not just all community. Sometimes that systemic bias as to how we respond to kids across one single school district can differ based on the perception of kids from certain communities versus kids from a different community. And we've seen similar situations where kids are situated similarly, but the system's reaction difference based on socioeconomics, based on race and ethnicity. All right, childhood trauma increases the chances of juvenile justice involvement by anywhere by as high as 55%. And if there's a consistent history of maltreatment, it increases the likelihood that that youth is going to commit a violent crime by 96%. And childhood trauma increases the chances of delinquency by as high as 55%. Involvement in our child welfare system due to abuse and neglect increases the likelihood of juvenile justice involvement and the likelihood that those kids are going to get involved at a younger age because of their child welfare involvement and remain in the juvenile justice system for longer periods of time compared to their counterparts who don't have child welfare involvement, right? So they get involved in the child welfare system at younger ages, which facilitate involvement in the juvenile justice system at younger ages. Oftentimes, this results in, again, a manifestation of all the pent-up anger as a result of the trauma of being removed from their community, being removed from their family, and the trauma of the abuse and neglect itself. Tough on crime policies, zero tolerance policies, also result in minority kids being given, and those kids involved in our child welfare system, being given developmentally inappropriate sanctions, right? And, oftentimes I'm talking to juvenile justice workers, and they use this adult-like language when talking about kids. And we know from the adolescent brain development research that kids are not wired the same. That executive function is not fully developed until mid-20s, and so here we are expecting 13 and 14-year-olds to take responsibility for their behaviors when they're dealing with oftentimes disabilities, behavioral disabilities. They're dealing with poverty. They're dealing with familial constructs that are oftentimes fragmented, and yet we bring them into an environment where there's zero tolerance, and oftentimes that leads to developmentally inappropriate sanctions. Youth placed in group homes are 2.5 times more likely to get involved in juvenile justice system. And so we had a slide earlier that talked about the likelihood of African Americans ending up in more congregate-like care as opposed to traditional foster home placements. And so as a result of that, that puts them at a greater risk for juvenile justice involvement. And then 90% of the youth that experience 5 or more placements in the child welfare system will enter the juvenile justice system. And I read in a piece of research a couple of years ago that 3 or more placements in the child welfare system places the kid at a greater risk for PTSD than combat veterans. So the more these kids move around our child welfare system, the more trauma is inflicted upon them, and the worse their behaviors will become, which facilitates juvenile justice involvement, which goes on to facilitate adult justice involvement. Black children are twice as likely to be placed in foster home as white kids in this nation, and because black kids are already subject to disproportionate rates of school discipline, and we'll talk about that in a minute, and the criminalization of black kids in public environments and public settings, whether it be just walking through the mall, perceived to be engaged in criminal behavior. Being a foster kid compounds this risk. So nationally, we see the same trend as we move through the juvenile justice system or the youth justice system across this country. About 26%, and African Americans are roughly 12 to 13% of the youth population in this country. And we see there are 26% of youth arrests, 44% of youth detained before adjudication, and 46% of those waived to adult court. 58% of those admitted to state prisons across the country. So again, we see the same trend as you move through the systems from front to back in our system nationally. Juvenile incarceration decreases the likelihood that a kid will complete their high school education as high as 39%. So when we start to funnel kids out of our learning environments into congregate care, into secure detention facilities, we decrease the likelihood that those kids are going to be successful in completing their high school education. And then juveniles incarcerated at a young age increases the chances of adult incarceration by as high as 41%. Simply put, when we start to put kids in cages at young ages, we facilitate the possibility that they will also be incarcerated as adults. So this is total African American population. Though African Americans constitute about 13% of the U.S. population in 2015, they constituted about 37% of the 1.4 million folks incarcerated in this country. So I want you to think about that. 13% of our nation's population account for over a third of our nation's incarcerated population. And that has increased by 1% in recent years. Lifetime chances of incarceration, if you're African Americans, about 32%. For Latinos, about 17%, and for Caucasians, about 5.9%. In 2012, the U.S. Bureau of Justice Statistics predicted that about 1 in 3 black men can expect to go to prison in their lifetime. And every time I hear that, I feel exceptional. 1 in 3 black men can expect to go to prison at some point in their lifetime. So you've met the youngest 3 grandchildren. Now meet the oldest 3. These boys this was about 10 years ago. We did a charity event, and these are my 3 oldest grandsons. Very good boys. In the front, there's Edward. He's the oldest of the 6 grandchildren. Just turned 17 in June, and just got his learner's permit to drive. The twins just turned 16 last week, and they're good boys. Elijah plays football, hard-hitting football player. Isaiah is a drummer and pianist, plays here at the church. And then Edward is a basketball player, and all 3 are very well-behaved boys. Here's what I know. At some point, these boys will misstep. They're not perfect. And they've been good kids. No trouble, no encounters with the law. But these boys have all the risk factors that oftentimes predisposes individuals to react and respond to them in very negative ways that facilitates some of their disparate outcomes. They're black. They're on free and reduced lunch. They're all living in single-parent homes. And that doesn't mean that they're at a disadvantage, because I'm very active in their lives. In fact, they're probably at my house right now eating up everything in the refrigerator. But they live with single moms. And then they're children of an incarcerated parent. My son is currently incarcerated. And so these boys have grown up with their father in and out of prison or jail. And so these kids have all those risk factors and all those labels that predispose individuals to treat them like, quote unquote, the bad kids, right? When they do normal adolescent things. So education, Penn School, Graduate School of Education, put out a piece of research a few years ago that looked at the disproportionate impact of K-12 suspensions on African American students in southern states. Nationally, about 1.2 million black students were suspended in a single school year from K-12. What they found was 55% of those suspensions occurred in 13 southern states. And yes, Kentucky and Tennessee were one of those 13 southern states. On average, black students were about 24% of the student population in the 3,022 school districts that they looked at. And here's what they found. In 132 school districts in those southern states, blacks were disproportionately suspended at a rate 5 times their representation in the general student population. 5 times. This next one will shock you. In 84 school districts across the South, they found that African Americans accounted for 100% of the suspensions from public schools. 100% of the suspensions from public schools in 84 school districts. In Mississippi alone, they found that 74% of the suspensions from public schools were African American students. And in Kentucky, African American students are roughly 11% of our student population. They account for 26% of the suspensions and 13% of the expulsions, and that's statewide. Now, we have about 115 counties that have very small populations of African Americans, most of them less than 1%. So 115 counties dump a whole lot of white kids into our data pool. So our state data is always the best picture. If you looked at this same data set for Louisville, you'd find that African Americans are about 26% of the population, and they are much higher of the population of kids suspended or expelled from school. So we see this in education as well. Research suggests that the disproportionality in how school discipline is carried out is a contributing factor to the achievement gap. What this simply says is that the kids who are disproportionately removed from the education environment fall behind. There's an achievement gap. Judge Teskey, who I know Craig knows, and some of many on the call, Judge Calloway knows, Judge Teskey started the School Justice Partnership, and what gave him the motivation to start that was he had a youth brought before his court that he literally had to lean over the bench to see because the kid was that small. And he realized that this kid is incapable of being a part of these proceedings. And so he called the superintendent, the school discipline guru, the principal, the assistant principal, and he had a conversation about we've got to do something different, right? And he started the School Justice Partnership. And what that partnership seeks to do is institute MOUs with all the agencies to have graduated response to kids misbehaving in school, graduated sanctions, right? Makes it longer and harder to get them to the juvenile justice system and into the secure detention facility. As a result, they saw suspensions and expulsions greatly decrease. And as a result of keeping kids in school, graduation rates shot up. They saw double-digit increases in graduation rates. And Judge Teskey always says this: who would have ever thought that keeping kids in school would increase graduation rates, right? Research also bears out a connection between the disproportionate rates in which African American students are suspended and expelled to their ultimate involvement in the juvenile justice system. And, I talk to educators all over the country, and I always ask this question: is it a good thing or a bad thing for kids to be out of school? And they all say it's a bad thing, right? And so the next question is, so why do we continue to suspend them? And I already know the answer in most cases. We don't have any other tools in the toolbox, right? We've got to maintain control of the learning environment. We've got to get those kids who are disruptive to the learning environment out of the classroom so that kids can learn. I get that. But rather than lobby for more policing, we need to lobby for the therapists that they need, the mentors that they need. We need to lobby for more tools in the educator's toolbox other than get this kid out of my classroom, get this kid out of my school, which ultimately facilitates some level of charging to get them into the school system, the juvenile justice system. Any comments before we leave the youth data and go into just a little bit of adult data?
Just had a comment. With grandchildren of color, these statistics keep me off balance and hypervigilant about what they are doing and where they are going and what they are wearing. Stressful for parents and grandparents.
Yes, I agree. We all have to stay hypervigilant on these issues. And again, the data. If you lack accessibility to data, or you guys don't currently have the ability to get at the data, then start to have conversations about how do we create data systems that will measure the reactions and responses and decisions that our system makes concerning kids across the racial spectrum, across socioeconomics, across our jurisdiction, right? So that we can clearly look at the data and be able to answer this question: is our system treating all kids or creating the same equitable outcomes for all kids? And in fact, they're not, then we can begin to let the data identify where we need to do our work. Any other questions or comments before we move on? All right, so let's talk about, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. It's all about resources and opportunities. Without either, the alternative is criminal behavior and more behavioral supports in schools, not just one for the entire school.
Yes, I agree. And here's the thing. I think if we make the resources available, we make it a priority, we can make the resources available. Oftentimes, we have this reaction to bad things in the community, which opens the door wide to our juvenile justice system as a result of a school shooting, right? We had a school shooting about 3 years ago in Marshall County. And as soon as we had that school shooting, within weeks, our complaint rate, our incarceration rate shot up. We had done a great job of minimizing and reducing complaints and reducing detention, and then we had a school shooting. And then every kid acting out of sorts was the next school shooter. And we overreacted, and we pushed a whole lot of kids. We had an autistic kid put in detention center because he drew a weapon on a piece of paper. And so we have these overreactions out of fear, oftentimes that facilitates, this increase in influx of kids into our system. And so if we thought about the need for resources as it relates to therapists and maybe even social workers in the school environment, then we can create more in-school options to divert some of this traffic from the juvenile justice system to get them the in-school services that they need. So let's talk about disparate incarceration equaling disparate disadvantages. African Americans as a whole in the adult prison system, rather, are incarcerated in state prisons across this country at a rate 5 times that of their white counterparts. In 12 states in this country, African Americans are more than 50% of the prison population. More than 50% of the prison population in 12 states. Here's the prison population broken down by these 3 race categories. Whites are 35% of our prison population. African Americans or Black are 38%, and Hispanics 21%. Now remember, African Americans are about 13% of the population, 12 or 13%, and yet they're the largest population in our prison system. Look at this per capita rate. Whites and Hispanics are right there together. 275 per 100,000 for whites, 278 per 100,000 for Hispanics. But look at African Americans, how big the gap is. 1,408 per 100,000 for African Americans, 6 times that of their Hispanic and white counterparts. I saw a comment, question. All right, here's what it looked. I'm sorry, go ahead.
There is no question about the fact that systemic bias exists and in too many cases bring kids into disciplinary processes they never needed to be involved in at all. There are other factors, however, that are driving some of these numbers too. What are you saying about more tools is right on. Think about community supports, empowering, educating, supporting, and educating faith groups and nonprofits who have kids programs. It's a great step.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Here's a prime example of that point, and I think that was a great comment because, I live in Hardin County, Kentucky, about 35 miles south of Louisville, right outside the gates of Fort Knox. Our county is divided really into the south and the north. On the south, we have Elizabethtown. On the north, we have the town that I live in called Radcliffe. They're roughly similar in population. I think Elizabethtown may have us about 3,000 or 4,000 folks. And when it comes to resources, everything's on the south end in Elizabethtown. Our judicial system is on the south end. Our child welfare system is on the south end. The Board of Ed is on the south end. Everything is on the south end. So when kids get in contact with our juvenile justice system and they're eligible for diversion opportunities, we had a gap in the availability of services on the north end where I live, and it's specifically for African-American kids. So we saw a disproportionate amount of African-American kids not getting access to diversion, therefore going into the court system. And so our administrative officer of the courts, Family and Juvenile Services Department, reached out to me and said, hey, we have a curriculum called Community Works, and we can come out and train your volunteer staff on this curriculum if you guys are willing to provide a diversion program on the north end. They trained about 15, 16 volunteers, gave us the curriculum, and basically referred the kids that were getting in trouble on the north end of the county to that diversion opportunity. So now we have a diversion opportunity on this end of the county for those kids who previously were being denied the opportunity, or even if they were given the opportunity, they oftentimes did not successfully complete their diversion because they had to travel once or twice a week to the south end of the county. And if they were already struggling socioeconomically speaking, didn't have transportation. We don't have a public transportation system. Those families ended up failing diversion and oftentimes over and over again not complying with their court mandate to complete diversion, and they end up being pushed forward to the next contact point, i.e. court. So once we opened that program on this end, well, we took in about 50% of the kids eligible for diversion end up going through our program. About 100 kids in the course of a year, and not one kid recidivated. So oftentimes you're right. There's that need for access within community. Here's what it looks like in Tennessee. The per 100,000 in the population. For whites, about 503 are incarcerated per 100,000. For Hispanics, about 595. For American Indian and Alaska Native, about 665. But look at African Americans, 1,962, nearly 2,000 per 100,000. Everybody else is way down around the 500, 600 mark. But African Americans are disproportionately incarcerated in Tennessee at nearly 3 times the rate of their white, Hispanic, and American Indian counterparts. So that completes my data presentation. Yes, the silence must be broken around racial and ethnic disparity, but it must be broken with substantive conversation. And that's why I'll always start with some type of data presentation, because we need to look at what's happening with children as they come into our systems, broken down by race, ethnicity. In some cases, gender and socioeconomics also intersect with the racial disparity conversation. The silence must be broken with factual and constructive conversation, and that's why I always challenge jurisdictions to continue to ask questions of your data components, right? Talk to your data people, continue to revise that data collection component to your departments and organizations, because the more we can become factual about what's happening to families, the more we can be constructive in this conversation. And then it's okay to be passionate, but remain productive as we have these conversations. Almost ready for a break. Let me get through a couple more slides and then we'll get you guys to a break. So I said in our objectives that we would talk about using a racial lens to examine policy and practice. Very simple point to be made when you think about using a racial lens, right? What does it mean? It means looking at our policies and our practice, what we do as an organization, and pull the data as we just looked at data, and determine if we have impact, similar impact across races of people, right? When in fact the data we just looked at, just a little bit of data we looked at from Tennessee, says that we're not having similar impact, right? African American kids are overrepresented in our juvenile justice and child welfare system, right? They have different outcomes, right? And when we realize our system is having differential impact, right, or disparate outcomes, right, revise those policies and practices to remove the potential for disparate treatment. Here's an example of that in Kentucky. So in Kentucky, we don't arrest kids. A complaint is filed. Anybody can file a complaint. When that complaint is filed, it's given to our court, what we call court-designated workers. They're the diversion arm to our juvenile justice system. Every kid is touched by the CDW's office. They determine whether a kid is eligible for detention at the front end, or whether or not they're eligible for cite and release. They determine whether or not a kid is diversion eligible or not, right? And they have to confer with the judge on release options. They have to confer with the judge. The judge and county attorney has an opportunity to override those diversion opportunities. So that first step is your kid got in trouble at school, your kid got in trouble at the grocery store, wherever they picked up this complaint. A document is sent from the court system to the family. And it basically says appear at the court designated workers office for this initial briefing about the citation. If you don't show up, they issue a second citation. Again, demanding that you appear at this place on this date and this time. Well, we realized as we looked at the data that a disproportionate amount of failure to appears, that's what you get when you don't respond to that second notice. You get a failure to appear. And then a warning is issued, and that child could be picked up at school and taken to detention until we get the attention of a parent. We saw in Jefferson County a disproportionate amount of failure to appears impacting the African American community. So we looked at the process, we looked at the practice and the policy, right? The policy said you issue these 2 letters. If they don't show up, you issue failure to appear. Then we did a little conversation around the identity piece, right? Cultural identity. Let's talk about these people, right? Their community context. Let's understand them, right? And then let's talk about your process. What we developed was, the conclusion Rachel Bingham, who was the head of Family and Juvenile Services, came to was the way she was conducting these initial contacts was not consistent with the way she makes her doctor's appointment. My doctor don't just send me a notice and tell me to be at his office at a certain time. Why am I doing it to these families? So she instituted a policy. You have to call the family, you have to contact the parent, and you have to negotiate. You have to explain the process to her so she's not afraid, and she understands that her kid is going home with her, that we're not going to arrest the kid and take him to jail, and that, we're just trying to get the kid where he or she needs to be. And you make an appointment that is amenable to her schedule. If she's a single parent mom and she's working multiple jobs and she can't really get off, then maybe her appointment needs to be made in between the 2 jobs. They changed that policy, and we saw a decrease of failure to appears statewide by 40%. Actually, I think about 44%. A decrease in failure to appears. In Jefferson County, where we initially identified the disparity, we saw a single digit, but a decrease nonetheless of about 8 or 9%, right? That was a simple policy change that facilitated a benefit for all populations across our state. We've done similar work around the overriding of African American kids in Jefferson County and in Christian County around the prosecutors and the judges overriding diversion eligible kids. And in Christian County, for instance, at the judicial level, we see a 66% decrease in judicial overrides for diversion. 66% of children that would have been overridden by the judge are now getting access to diversion, right? And we know from doing a 3-year study on our diversion programs that nearly 80% of the kids who complete diversion successfully don't recidivate in a 3-year period. 40% of the kids that fail diversion don't recidivate. Diversion works, right? And so, looking at your policies and practices through that racial lens and adjusting them to remove that potential for disparate treatment is what we mean when we say use the racial lens to examine policy and practice, right? Any comments or questions before we take a break and go to break?
Yeah, this is a great interpretation of how to affect change through data. Well done on that policy change. Wow, what a difference. Also, when it says failure to appear also deals with transportation and other events.
Right.
Can CFSS be helpful in helping parents understand policies and procedures concerning children?
Yeah, and I failed to say that a part of that cultural identity. So at the same time I'm having conversations with them about policy and practice, we're having a cultural identity lesson as well to really understand the population that we're serving, right? And one of the things that came out in that cultural identity conversation is accessibility to public transportation, right? And location of your offices. So everybody had to come downtown to this diversion office, right? So not only did we change how we made those appointments, we also changed the location. We took that office and we split it, and we started setting up offices in community. So now some folks who had to get on public transportation or get a ride to get to their diversion appointment can now, to their initial assessment appointment, can now walk to those appointments because we took the locations and put their offices in those community locations and made it accessible to get to some of those appointments. So it was a matter of examining our system, examining our policy, understanding the demographic of people we were trying to reach, stop talking about them, have a conversation with them. And as a result, we were able to make significant reduction in failure to appears. And it's affected all populations. And we've started to see movement in the right direction around minority populations.
Okay. We have also one final comment here. Anyone who does not believe that implicit bias or systemic racism doesn't exist should take a look at the data. The numbers are there, and they are real.
Yes, and I totally agree. And I tell you what, in the work with Tennessee, we have not even touched the surface yet. We've got so much data we need to get at, and the system as it currently stands is limited, and so we've got so much data we need to peel back and begin to analyze in the context of policy and practice, right? But also in the context of community, and this work won't really start to yield significant results without a partnership between the system and institutions and community. And so, again, all right, guys, welcome back from break. So let's start with this video. So Jill, if you'll go ahead and take the reins again, and let me set this video up. So this is a video clip from Grey's Anatomy, and an African American kid who lives in an affluent community lost his key, and he's returning home from school, and he decides to climb through the window of his home. Police are called, he's shot, and at the end of the day, he died at the hospital. And so this is Jackson coming out of the notification room telling his parents that he had just passed away. And these two police officers are there waiting to get his final report, the doctor's final report, as well as a report from the other doctor standing beside. Jackson gives a great explanation and says some critical things in understanding the conversation around implicit bias. So as you guys listen to this, I want you to think about what you're hearing, what you're seeing, and what are your reactions. Go ahead, Jill. first thing the one officer says is the officer made a judgment call. And Jackson responds immediately by saying, there's no judgment in that call. There's just a reaction, right? And so when we think about implicit bias, we have to think about this idea that it's a reaction. It's an instantaneous reaction, an instant reaction to a person based on their physical appearance. The officer said he made a judgment call. Jackson immediately pushed back and said, there's no judgment in that call. There was no set of facts that you deliberated in that instant. He says there's just a reaction. And then he makes this statement. He says the reaction you give to a white kid in that moment, in that split second, versus a black or brown kid is the measurable difference. In other words, we can measure these types of things, right? We can collect data on every reaction that our system has to black and brown communities versus white communities, poor communities versus affluent communities. We can measure what justice looks like across a given demographic, right? And that's the measurable difference, right? We can look at that data and we can see oftentimes measurable difference, as we saw in the data we just looked at, right? And he says that's the measurable, and he says and fixable, right? Those things are measurable and fixable, right? So once we see and we can quantify the differences, right? We can fix our systems and their reactions to black and brown kids versus Caucasian kids. And the first thing the officer did that was sitting there, his first response was, we're not racist, right? Because again, everyone goes to protecting themselves from that ugly accusation of being a racist. And implicit bias is the furthest thing from actually being a racist, right? We're all biased, but we're not all racist, right? And then he talks about it being fixable, and then he says the only way we're going to fix it is to acknowledge it, right? He says you can fix it. You have protocols in place. You can adjust those, right? Every policy, every practice, right, can be adjusted, right? If the Kansas assessment proves to be have inherent biases in it, we can change. We can get another assessment, right? We can do the Gaines SS is what Kentucky uses, right? There are other assessments out there that we can use that may remove the potential for disparate outcomes, right? Or we can pretend like it doesn't exist, no matter what we see in the data. And I run into people all the time that no matter what we show them in data, it's not about race, right? Race is not facilitating the disparities, right? Yet the data suggests that based on race, we see different outcomes. We see differential processing, right? We see the system react and respond differently, right? And so that's why I think in some cases, the lack of data is intentional, right? And so Jackson makes a very interesting points in this video that I think will catapult us forward in this conversation. Was there anything to add? And I will say, Sharon, get ready to unmute yourself and go on a journey with me. I want Sharon to be my assistant in this conversation here in a little bit. Any other conversations about this particular video? We have a part 2 of this particular episode coming up here in a couple of slides. But Jill, you can turn it back over to me. But I wanted to know whether you guys thought that there were any other points you wanted to bring out.
I believe the police are afraid of black men and boys, but why?
Right, and again, we deal with this over-criminalization of black boys, right? And the bias against them increases. We see measurable increases in their response and their outcomes. The bigger and the blacker or darker they appear, right? The more criminalized they are. And so you're correct that they have biases or bias reactions to black and brown boys, especially when those black and brown boys are fairly dark and fairly large. Anybody else?
Yes. Police have the power. They don't have to use the gun. Just knowing that an officer has a gun puts anyone on high alert.
Right.
And then Also, fear is so powerful, it's a prominent component of life. It can distort and sway our human psyche.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And fear is, yeah, very much so. Fear is deadly. And can biases truly be changed, is a question.
Yes. Yes. I'll use one of mine, very, very clear and vivid and even funny example for some of you all to show that bias can be altered. Anybody else? All right. So get ready, Ms. Sharon Baker. I'm going to use you. You're going to be my co-presenter in this segment. I don't want to tap into Jill because she's already working those videos for me. Jill, you're doing a great job. I appreciate you. So when we think about bias, and we think about another term we use in this space is unconscious bias, and that's important. Implicit social cognition is another term that we use. What is it, right? They're the attitudes and stereotypes we all have, right, that affect our understanding, actions, and our decisions. And here's the key, in an unconscious manner, right? So there are certain things that we do unconsciously, right? Certain reactions we have that are not necessarily consciously processed, right? Implicit bias is one of those things, right, that happens automatically without you consciously being aware, right? So I often tell people that your implicit bias is something that does you. It's something that happens in you and happens to you. It's not something you actually consciously do, right? And that's the difference in bias versus prejudice, right? Because oftentimes we think, well, you know, if I'm biased, I'm prejudiced. No, you're not prejudging, right? Because you're not even conscious that you're reacting and responding this way. Prejudice would mean you processed it consciously, and you've come to the conclusion that all black men are, right? Most of us would say, no, I don't believe that. But we still may have a biased reaction, an implicit, a stereotypic response to black males in certain scenarios, right? So that's what bias is, right? Our biases are activated involuntarily and without our awareness or our intentional control. They just happen to us, right? We don't process them consciously, right? They're not based on information or fact that we've gathered. They're just a reaction. And we have them unconsciously. I always like to tell people our biases don't necessarily mirror our conscious beliefs. So if you're already trying to, you know, dispel the possibility that you could be biased because consciously, you know, I have a black son-in-law, or I have a Caucasian daughter-in-law, or, you know, my grandson is biracial, or you're thinking about, you know, all of these pieces. Well, check this out. I'm black, and I've been black all my life. So I can't be biased against black men because I'm black, right? I grew up in the inner city of Chicago. I can't be biased against young black males in the inner city of Chicago. I was once one of them. I grew up and thought it was a great childhood growing up in the inner city, in poverty. And I didn't realize that I was growing up in such a disadvantaged community until I left that community, started traveling the world. So I'm not prejudiced against black males in the inner city because I used to be one of those. However, if I'm at home in Chicago in the community I grew up in today, at 10:30 at night and I see 3 black males coming towards me, without thought and without control, I'm going to experience anxieties, fear. I'm going to have hesitations. I may engage in discriminatory behaviors by going back to my car, acting as if I forgot something. I may cross over to the other side of the street to keep from crossing the path of these 3 gentlemen, right? My response is going to be automatic and unconscious, right? But consciously, I don't hold the belief that just because they're in this community, that makes them dangerous, right? It's something that happens without my control or without my awareness. So, Sharon, how are you?
I'm well, thank you. And you?
I'm doing great, Sharon. Sharon, what do you work at?
I work for Family and Children Service nonprofit agency in Nashville, Tennessee, where I am the I'm ACES facilitator and the community engagement coordinator.
ACES facilitator. Wow. So you're very familiar with that adverse childhood experience thing, right?
A little bit.
Good, good. So Sharon, you get off work late one night and you park your car in a parking garage, and there's the building that you work in. There's a lot of other agencies and organizations in that building, and it's after dark. You get off work after dark, probably around 9 o'clock at night, and you walk into your car. You hear footsteps behind you. You look over your shoulder, and there's a woman. Maybe she's about 5'7", maybe 120, 130 pounds. How you feel? You okay? You nervous? You afraid?
Not at all.
No?
Nope.
Not even a little bit?
No, not really. I mean, she's a woman. I'm a woman. I'm pretty sure of myself. I could probably take her.
Oh, girl. All right. Same scenario. You get off work about 9 o'clock at night. It's after dark. You're going to your parking lot. You hear footsteps. And you look over your shoulder, and there's a man. He's about 6'6", maybe 235, 240 pounds. How you feel now?
Nervous.
Nervous?
Yeah.
Oh.
Just
one last scenario. This individual walking behind you, this male, 6'6", about 235 pounds, he's wearing dark clothing and a hoodie. And at some point, he starts to pick up his pace. Now how you feel?
Really nervous. My
nervous.
heart's jumping out of my chest at this point, probably.
Wow. What do you do in a scenario like that, Sharon, when you are really nervous and your heart's jumping out of your chest? Well, I mean, what do you do?
I'm probably going to pick up my pace, or I'm going to run, or I'm going to get really defensive. If he's way too close, then I probably will try to, go, what are you doing? Or why are you following me? Or, I probably would get very defensive if I can't run.
Wow, okay. So you don't have mace, you don't carry pepper spray?
No.
Do you do the thing where you put your keys between your knuckles?
No.
No? Okay, yeah. Typically, I get that response. I'm going to grab my pepper spray or my mace or put my keys between my knuckles. But nonetheless, you had a different response. Well, here's what you didn't know, because I knew these individuals. That lady that was about 5'7", about 130 pounds, she was an escapee from a mental hospital about a mile away.
Oh,
and
wow.
She had a weapon. But you were comfortable. You were okay.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah, she was a psychopath. And there you were, all comfortable, letting her just walk right up next to you, no problem. And the guy was actually an attorney in the building a couple of floors above you, and he was going to the gym after work, and so that's why he was in his sweat clothes. And then he only picked up his pace because his wife told him he needed to rush home because one of the kids was having a medical emergency. And yet there you are,
wow.
having some, and in some cases you may have a reaction to him that could be bad for him, like pepper spraying him or gouging him with your keys or even calling the police.
Right.
And if he's black, that could turn bad.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right.
Wow.
And you don't have any facts. You didn't know that the woman was a psychopath, but yet because of the way she looked and because of her gender, you were okay.
It was gender for me, yeah.
And just because the man was big and wearing dark clothing, and his behavior was frightful to you, you had a different reaction, right?
Right.
That's what our implicit associations do to us. They instantly give us some context. They fill in missing data. They tell us there's a reason to be dangerous, as opposed to there's a reason to be okay, right? And we'll talk about this a little further, and we'll keep using this example a little further. Thank you, Sharon. I appreciate you.
Thank you.
So our conscious beliefs are not the only influence over how we behave and how we respond to people and the decisions that we make. There are many in the field of psychology that believe that your unconscious bias, your unconscious beliefs about people and individuals have a greater influence on your feelings and your decisions and your actions. So, simply put, our biases are the internal lens that in an instant they interpret for us what or who we're seeing. Like, without thought, Sharon's bias, her affinity bias, and we'll talk about that a little bit, but her affinity bias said that the woman was okay, and she was the psychopath. But her affinity bias said, oh, nothing to be afraid of. She's a lady like me. And but her implicit association with the man said just the opposite, right? Danger, danger, right? And so these biases are that internal lens that interprets externally what or who we're seeing, right, for us in an instant, right? And these associations that we have, they develop over the course of our lifetime through messaging, right? Through direct and indirect messaging, right? So I want you to think about that last statement as Jill gets ready to play this next video, which is the second half of the Grey's Anatomy video. And Dr. Bailey goes home and she feels the need to have a conversation with her son. And so in this video, her and her husband set her son down and they're having a conversation, right? And I want you to look at this video, and as you look at it, I want you to think about that fact that these biases, this internal lens, is given to us in our early childhood development stage through direct and indirect messaging. And most of us would agree that the primary source for direct messaging in early childhood development is our parents. And so here's a set of parents messaging their child about policing. Go ahead, Jill. We warn our kids about the world. We tell them what to expect. We tell them things are dangerous based on our experience. We tell them things are bad based on our experiences, right? And so early childhood messaging. Anybody have this message given to them as a child by their parent, or perhaps you've given this message to your children? I'd like to hear from you. Any comments?
This is Tamika. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So I'm Tamika from Tennessee, obviously. But yes, I have, as a boy mom of three boys of color, we have 100% had this conversation with our son. And my husband is a police officer, so he is, you know, a black person who wears blue. So he can cover both dichotomies. I mean, it's pretty amazing the seat that he sits in. But yes, we have had to have this conversation with our oldest, who is 20, as well as our youngest, who is 13, and then our middle son is 16. So very hard conversation, but very much a necessity to have given the time that we live in.
Now, Tamika, stay unmuted for a minute. Now, this is a rare occasion for me because this is a tough conversation. And when I talk about this conversation, I talk about it as a double-edged sword, right? Because, let's say this kid in this video has a great relationship with his school resource officer. Let's say his school resource officer is your husband. He has a great relationship with him. They joke, they have a conversation. I'm sure your husband's a great guy, right? And you can see your husband, having the confidence of kids and being a confident friend to kids. And yet this kid comes home and he's told to lock his hands behind his head, and his parents start to have this conversation. Do you think a conversation like this could change a kid's perception of your husband?
Absolutely. My husband actually was an SRO for, I don't know, 10 years maybe of his 20-year career. He's a detective now, but he did get his start as a school resource officer. And I guess kind of looking at it both ways, when a parent has that type of conversation with their child, but then when they turn around and they go to a school and they have a good resource officer, like I'm not saying my husband's the best, but he is a really, really good one. I really think that they pair together so they can hear this at home from their parents saying, okay, this is what you need to do. But at the same time, not all officers are good, and not all officers have your best interest at heart, but some of them do. And so I think if that child can see both, they can see that there is a SRO or a police officer in general who is looking out for their best interest, then that stimulates conversation at home, because then that child can go home and say, well, Mom, Dad, my school resource officer is awesome and he does this with us. And so I think there's a lot of learning that can be done, I think, across both bridges. I feel like just because we've had to do that, with our children, my husband he gets nasty messages from parents and, of the like, but at the same time, the kids love him. And so they can go home and tell their parent, he's good, he does right by me. And so that parent has to, in turn, hopefully hear that and then know that not all officers are bad. Not all of them are out to get you.
Right, yeah. So I thought that was interesting that you pointed out that dichotomy of having law enforcement in the house, but then you and your law enforcement husband have to have this conversation with your kids. And there's a double-edged sword here because, one, I try to tell police officers, and I spent a year embedded in the Louisville Metro Police Department training police officers. All 1,200 sworn police officers went through a training with me. And what's sad about this conversation is putting the burden of that kid coming out of this encounter with law enforcement on the shoulder of a kid. Because everything they said to that kid is counter to what that kid is most likely to do. When kids are afraid, they run.
Yeah.
And so to tell that kid, if you're afraid, no matter how afraid you get, never run from them. That's counterculture to his normal reaction, especially if he can't tell who that is yelling at him from a distance, telling him to stop. Well, when I was a kid growing up in Southside Chicago, if I heard a voice coming from down a dark alley saying, stop right there, I'm gone. I mean, it's tennis shoes and butt. That's all you're going to see. I'm gone, right? And so I'm not stopping until I get to my front porch, right? And so this whole idea, when I put on my you're in trouble voice with my grandsons, you know what they do? Put their hands in their pocket and they start looking around. So we're putting the burden of their safety. When law enforcement fail to have these conversations and understand that bias is a two-way street, many of the young people you will encounter have bias against police, and not at their own doing. Oftentimes they've gotten these messages from parents in an attempt to keep them safe. So I need you to understand their bias so that you don't escalate the situation because of their fidgetness, because of their movements, because of their lack of eye contact, because they put their hand in their pocket. I need you to bring it down. I need you to help calm this kid down so that he realizes you are safe, right? But oftentimes law enforcement won't have these conversations in these trainings, and then parents are at home educating and training their kids how to have a safe encounter with law enforcement. That's a lot of of weight to put on a 12-year-old, a 13-year-old. And so it's important that we break that blue wall and say, guys, we're not here to accuse you. We're not here to make you feel bad. We're not here to call you racist. We're here to help you understand this important conversation about bias. And that's what I told the Louisville Metro. It's a two-way street. If you stop me on a dark country road after dark, I need you to realize I'm black. And I'm going to tell you what that means so you know how to help me, because I have a bias reaction to this encounter that could facilitate my demise. And I need you to understand that and help me bring it down. I need you to get into de-escalation mode and not the escalation mode. That's even more critical when we're talking about youth, when we're talking about young people. Everything they told that kid in the video is countercultural to young people. They play with toy guns. They run from danger, right? They run for danger. You ask them a question, they have the answer. They're quick to answer, right? And so everything they're telling this kid, he's less likely to do and most likely to do the opposite, right? And why does the child have to bear the burden of getting home safe, right? So very important conversation that we have. But messaging from our parents, both direct and indirect, starts to formulate that internal lens, starts to give us a view of the world, right? So let me introduce you to my parents. My parents, thank you, Tamika. My parents grew up in the 40s and 50s in rural Arkansas. You guys are not too far from Arkansas. If you leave Memphis, you're probably 45 minutes to an hour from the town I was born in, Blytheville, Arkansas. I was born right there in Blytheville. Yeah. And my parents moved to Chicago when I was less than a year old, before my first birthday. They moved to Chicago. And so every once in a while, I'll go back to Arkansas to visit the place I was born. They're in Chickasaba Hospital. But they grew up in the 40s and 50s in rural Arkansas. So you know what the environment was like. You know what Jim Crow looked like in the 40s and 50s. You know that grandma gave them serious instructions when going to town about not looking at white people in the eye. Don't argue with white people. Don't debate with white people. Don't look at them white girls. Don't be whistling at nobody, trying to holler at anybody. You know, they gave them specific instructions, right? And they were called all kinds of names and mistreated in very intentional and direct ways. You know how it was, right? These are the people who are messaging me now about the world. Now they're messaging me from their experience, right? And so they told me some very clear and very intentional things about white people. Stay away from them. Don't trust them. Don't argue with them. Don't look them in the eye. You answer them, yes, sir, yes, ma'am. And you try to get out of their presence as soon as possible. Avoid them at all costs. All these kinds of things, right? And they were very explicit about white girls, because when I got to high school in Chicago, your middle school and your elementary school is pretty segregated to your community. When you got to high school, you went to other schools. So when I went to high school, they knew I was going to be in a very diverse population. And so the messages began to change a little bit. And they kept telling me, stay away from the white girls. Do not try to date a white girl. When her father finds out, it'll be rape, and there'll be no defense for you. When they accuse you of something, you're in trouble, right? All my life. So here's how it affected me later on in life. I'm in my 40s, Christy. And in my 40s, I could get on an elevator, and Christy, you could get on the same elevator, and I would have a panic attack. I would just imagine every movement that you made as a prelude to an accusation. You clutch your purse because you're about to accuse me of attempting to rob you. You're fixing your garments because you think I'm trying to look at you in some inappropriate way. And so everything you did was making my anxiety intensify. And it would get so bad that I just had to get off the elevator. I couldn't take it. And I had no idea where this was coming from. Why did I have this reaction when stuck or trapped in an elevator with a white woman? And I realized, as I started to dig into the implicit bias research, I realized that I was having an implicit reaction, a stereotypic reaction based on the messaging my parents gave me. That being alone, being in an environment with a white woman with no witnesses could be bad. And I had this reaction. And I'll tell you how I dealt with that as we get a little bit further. So the messaging that we receive, right? It's both direct and indirect messaging. Oftentimes, our parents indirectly message us about other people groups. I stand away from them. That's an indirect message that we say to ourselves, they say to themselves, right? Messaging. In addition to those early childhood messages that we receive from our parents, the media, television programming, TV news is often cited as origins or perpetuators of implicit associations. So how does the media impact us around stereotypes and attitudes about other groups? How does the media impact us? Anybody raised in the 60s and 70s, maybe mid-70s, you are 12 to maybe 18 years old in that teenage state. You remember how you felt when Roots came out? Yeah. And you know, you went to school the next day mad at everybody. You know, your white teacher that you love made you mad. I mean, because television programming affects us. It impacts how we see the world. It impacts some of those stereotypic ideas we have about people who are different than us. So as a kid growing up in the 60s and 70s, looking for myself, looking for my future in media, I didn't find a lot of hope that I was going to escape this urban community I lived in and be a doctor or a lawyer or the mayor or the president, or I just didn't see black people in positive lights. In fact, the television was, you know, a reflection of the community in which I lived in. Many of my friends, like me, grew up in single-parent homes. Now, my home was a single-parent home, but it was not a fatherless home. My dad was very involved in my life. Grew up in neighborhoods where the buildings were dilapidated and broken down and oftentimes torn down, and vacant lots were left in their places. High crime rates. So the television reiterated my existence. I didn't think black people lived in suburbs. And I didn't think black people had important jobs growing up in the 60s and 70s, because that's not what the television revealed to me. So oftentimes I had negative stereotypes in the form of news and media. Any other ideas of how the media impacts some of our stereotypic imaging? Had a lady tell me a couple weeks ago, you know, she had been told when you're traveling into Louisville, downtown Louisville, don't go past 9th Street. You get past 9th Street, you're in the bad part of town. And she ended up on 11th Street, and she was sitting there in a car trying to figure out, you know, her navigation system at a stoplight, trying to figure out her navigation system to get out of the bad neighborhood. And a black lady with a cast on one of her legs and a cane walked up to the car and tapped on the window, and she looked up and saw this black woman looking into her window, tapping on her window, and she sped through the red light to get away from her. And when she got to a place where she felt safe, she stopped and she had this conversation with herself about, why did I respond that way? That woman was probably trying to help me. That woman could have realized that I was a little bit out of my neighborhood or out of the way, and she was trying to help me and give me direction. Instead, I looked at her, and out of fear, I sped off through a red light to get to what I felt was a safer environment, right? So the media and stereotypes of certain groups of people and communities impact our reactions and responses oftentimes. Any comments, any thoughts about this particular piece? I've got a couple examples to show you. All right, here's an example. Katrina, 2005. Two different newspapers did an article on this particular day. One writes of this individual you see in the picture, and they say, young man walks through chest-deep floodwaters after looting a grocery store in New Orleans, right? Same day, different paper, kind of covering similar activity. And here's what they write. Two residents wade through chest-deep waters after finding bread and soda from a local grocery store, as if the store was open and they just went shopping. He's looting the grocery store, and they just went to the grocery store to find bread and soda. And he's a young man, and they're given the benefit of being two residents, right? How we characterize people in media impacts our bias. we often show, now this young man is doing exactly what they're doing, trying to survive until somebody comes and rescues them. You can tell by the depth of the water that these were some of those pictures. These folks were some of those people we saw on rooftops or on the top of vehicles waiting to be rescued. And for some reason, they needed to get down and go find food. And the chances are the grocery store that they're accused of finding food and looting was probably destroyed by the floodwaters. Who knows? That stuff they have in their hands could have been floating in the water. But the newspaper decided to call him a looter and call them residents just trying to survive, right? How the media depicts us in some of these articles are interesting, right? I remember seeing two different articles. This was going on at the same time. A white guy out west killed his entire family, killed them. Wife, beautiful kids, killed them. And all the pictures showed him and his family together, happy. They talked about how he was a Sunday school teacher. They talked about all these great things that he did and how shocking this is, and it must have been mental health and on and on and on. At the same time, a black man was on trial because he caught a man trying to rape his daughter and killed him. And they talked about his prior criminal history, and they vilified this man and made him seem like this man who was just a criminal and needed to be put away. And all he was doing was responding to seeing a man attempting to do harm to his child, and yet he was depicted in very negative and very stereotypic ways. And so the media impacts oftentimes those stereotypes and attitudes that we have about people of different race and ethnicity, and even sometimes by how we feel about whole communities. So as Jill takes control again, I'm going to show you in these next two videos, and we're going to have some conversation in between each video. But I'm going to show you in these next two videos how in commercials the media kind of presents folks in very stereotypic ways. So let's have some conversation on the back end of each of these videos. So Jill, if you'll go ahead and cue the video up, and let's look at both of these videos and think about how the media kind of stereotypes folks and how they present them. Jill, do you have that? Christy, can you guys hear me? Are we still broadcasting?
Okay, yes, we can hear you.
Yes,
okay,
we can hear you.
So I just wanted to make sure it wasn't on my end. Jill, can you cue up that next video?
I'm working on it. 1 second.
All right. Maybe I'll try, and maybe we can hear it through my mic. You want me to try it?
If you want to do that, that's fine.
What? I can pour this champagne on my phone and it still work. What? Yeah, look. Kenny, I'm about to put you in a fish tank. What? That's crazy. That phone can't do that, Max. Here, I have another. What?
The new water-resistant Galaxy S7 Edge.
Did you guys hear that?
Yes.
You guys heard that? Great. Great. So when you look at that video, what do you think about how they were cast? Do you see intelligent? Do you see employed? Do you see educated? I mean, what do you see in that particular video as it relates to stereotypic imaging? I know when I first saw it, I wasn't at all happy with it. I think that it depicts people who look like me in very stereotypic ways. When I did training with the Louisville Metro Police Department, they said if they saw someone dressed in that attire with multiple cell phones on them, they would think drug dealer. And yet in the video, Lil Wayne says to his friend, "Here, have another," right? Very stereotypic in the way they were kind of presented in that particular video. What do you guys think? Thoughts? Anybody had any comments on that video?
This is Tamika again. I 100% agree with what you said. On the flip side, however, I think that they need to take some kind of accountability, because at the end of the day, they could have said, acting this way will make me seem like fill in the blank, or make me look like, and I refuse to
lower myself.
And
Yep.
so I think that it kind of goes both ways. It makes us look bad, but he chose to take on that role.
Yeah. Not very flattering at all, right? And very stereotypic, right? So someone that does not know who these individuals are, and already have a bias towards urban rappers, whatever you want to call it, whatever stereotype you see in that commercial, this video comes along and it goes, yep, that's how they are, right? In the entire video, they were trying to destroy that phone. They were being very destructive, very irresponsible with something that was very valuable, right? And so, again, it perpetuates the stereotypes that some have about black people, right? About people from the rap culture, about young urban folks, right? And so, same company, different commercial. So let's look at this one and let's compare it and contrast it to the last
Would you like me to share this one, Pastor?
one. How well was it through my mic? Was it okay?
I thought it was, but mine was okay, but the video was a little choppy.
Okay, well, go ahead, Jill. You can take it. If you got the next one queued up, go ahead and take it and cue it up, and let's listen at it. All right, guys, what are your thoughts, right? So, different looking individual, and the entire commercial, he's doing what? He's trying to protect his valuable phone, right? He's not being irresponsible. He's not, intentionally trying to destroy it. The whole while he's being responsible and trying to keep this phone from falling, right? Compared to the previous group where they're actually attempting to be destructive, right? Would it not have been believable to see him in a hotel room or in a room in the same context as the previous group? Maybe the advertiser at Samsung thought not, right? At the end of this commercial, they give a little bit of context, gain the freedom to fumble. In other words, we can all relate to him. We've all fumbled our phone at one time or another. But, very rarely do I run into anybody that says, when I got my phone and I saw where it was water resistant, I dumped it in the fish tank, or I poured a glass of ice water on it, right? We hope that in the event we drop it in water, it is waterproof, but very few of us will actually take a chance and just dump it in a fish tank, right? So the second guy, you know, they have a little bit of context, you know, because we can relate to trying to protect our phone, trying to keep it from falling, right? But if it does, we got you with the water resistant, shock resistant Galaxy S7 Edge, right? Any other comparisons or contrast to the two? The white guy appears to be on his job, employee, intelligent, suburban, family man, you know, just the opposite. You're left to kind of wonder, who are these three guys in the I don't know if it's a hotel room or their home, I don't know, but who are these guys and why are they in this nice house or hotel room and why are they being destructive? And there's a lot of unanswered questions that oftentimes will lead to one's bias kind of categorizing them. Very few people who don't know them would assume that they were millionaires or very smart and very intelligent business individuals, as Lil Wayne is noted to be a very smart businessman. Why he made such a stereotypic, probably because of the business aspect and the resources he was paid.
I didn't know who Lil Wayne was, so I just thought the commercial was stupid when I first saw it. And the second one, obviously, you're showing a white-collar white man who has a family and a home and all of those kinds of things that seem more stable and more productive than the first commercial did.
Right. Yeah, and we constantly see that. It's gotten a lot better. There's a lot more diversity. And I don't know if any of you guys have noticed, there's even more diversity since the George Floyd thing. We've seen much more diversity in advertisement as a result of these last couple of months. I noticed that right away. And so it's gotten a lot better, but we still occasionally will see some of those stereotypic presentations of minority populations in advertisement, in news programs. For instance, the news. I mean, rarely will they go into an African-American community and spend time reporting good things. Typically, it happens when bad things happen, and then they show up in minority communities with cameras and they want to give context to what just occurred, right? And that's why people kind of have this idea of black-on-black crime, right? Because the only time they see a black person involved in crime is oftentimes when it's been perpetrated one black person upon another, right? What very few folks actually realize is that there's white-on-white crime and there's Latino-on-Latino crime. The reality is we typically commit crime in the environment in which we live and socialize. And so there's only 6 or 7 percentage points between blacks murdered by other blacks compared to whites murdered by other whites, right? They're almost killing each other at similar rates. And so, but yet, you know, people are quick to point out, you know, black on black crime. Well, that's just a social reality that people commit crime. Bernie Madoff, he killed a whole bunch of, he robbed a whole bunch of rich people, predominantly white rich people, right? Because that's the environment in which he operated. So when he committed his egregious crime, it was against people who looked like him, who lived in similar situations as he did, who worked with him, right? He robbed the people that resembled his social environment. So implicit bias are those mental shortcuts to judging or categorizing people, right? Our implicit bias helps us to categorize people in an instant, right? These mental shortcuts create blind spots that prevent us from seeing vital pieces of a person's life experience, right? They hide the facts from us, right? Like in the parking lot, right, Sharon? They tell us the woman is safe, which was a lie, and they tell us that the man was dangerous, which was also a lie, right? So these mental shortcuts kind of hide us from blind spots. We don't really have all the facts, but we're jumping to a conclusion nonetheless, right? these mental shortcuts, we all rely on these cognitive shortcuts to do a few things for us. One, we rely on them to filter information that we receive. They become a filter for information that we receive. They help us to fill in the missing data, right? They tell us what we don't know, right? They give us very strong responses to information we don't really have, but yet we feel that this information is valid. They help us to categorize people according to our own cultural stereotypes, right? So if you're black and you pull up to a gas station and you see 3 Caucasian young men get out of a pickup with bandanas on, and maybe you see a Confederate flag or something that resembles a Confederate flag, your cultural stereotype to categorize these individuals is probably, well, they're rednecks, right? If you're white and you see 3 black males get out of a Chevy Caprice with 22s and heavy bass and baggy blue jeans, right? You typically say thugs, drug dealers, right? Because those are our cultural stereotypes. That's what our mental shortcuts do to us. They categorize people for us right away. They affect everyone, even people of the same race. So guys, I want you to tell me what comes to mind when you see this picture. How do you categorize the individual in this picture? What do you think? How do you categorize this individual? I saw the chat room light up. You got some comments in there?
Upstanding member of the community.
Okay.
Somebody's pastor.
All right. Outstanding members of the community, somebody's pastor. What else?
We have a scholar, a role model, professional businessman, leader.
Okay. All right. What about this guy? How do you categorize this guy? Scholar, businessman, politician?
A loner.
Loner?
Suspect.
What?
Suspect, suspicious.
Okay, suspect. Okay.
Scary.
Scary. All right.
We have druggy.
Druggy.
Shady type.
Shady.
Yep. Homeless.
Homeless.
Someone in trouble.
Someone in trouble.
Hiding. Hopeless.
Hiding. Hopeless. And what does this picture reveal to you?
Is that the same person?
Yes, that's the same person. Now, here's the question. What happened? What happened from the top to the bottom? What changed?
Clothing, posture.
Posture. Mm-hmm.
And let me ask you a question. Where did the interpretation of the change occur?
In our minds.
There you go.
Yeah.
You have to own it. That's the only point. I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with seeing the guy up top and going, how you doing, sir? Right? Wondering, he's a lawyer. He's a politician. He's a businessman. And there's nothing wrong with seeing the guy at the bottom and going, let me avoid him. Let me walk around him. Wow, is this guy on drugs? My point is that the perception changed in your mind. His personality didn't change because his clothing did. His personality didn't change because his posture did. What changed is your perception of him based on his posture, based on his clothing. And that's okay as long as you own it as being internal and you don't project it onto him. Because that's what George Zimmerman did to Trayvon Martin. George Zimmerman decided that this black kid in this hoodie, in this gated community, this time of the evening should not be. There's something suspicious about this. There's something wrong here. And George Zimmerman couldn't talk himself down. So suspicion led to pursuit, led to engagement, and ended in the death of a child. The death of somebody's baby. Because George Zimmerman didn't know how to control his own perception. And when they came and pulled that baby's body up off the ground, all they found on that child was Skittles. No stolen property, no window fragments from breaking someone's car window, just Skittles. All because George Zimmerman didn't know how to deal with his perception. Whatever you think about this character at the bottom, you own it. Don't make it his responsibility. Don't project it onto him, right? Don't feel the need to call the police and have them come and possibly this ends bad for this character. There's nothing criminal about what we see in this picture. Now, is there criminal perceptions in our minds? Sure. Sure. What is he up to? Why is he here? Right? That could be me leaning against that building, which is right outside my door here. That could be me. I changed clothes because I'm going on a run, and I'm actually got my earpiece in talking to my wife before I take off on my run. And somebody sees me leaning against that building and call the police, and it goes bad from there, right? And now you feel bad because you called the police, right? Well, the point is that your perception is just that. It's your perception. And you have to own it, right? You have to own what you perceive and deal with that within yourself and not necessarily make it his problem. Again, as George Zimmerman did to Trayvon Martin, right? His suspicion of Trayvon Martin ended in his death, right? We see a similar situation in Ferguson, right? We see a similar situation in New York, in Baltimore, right? Where, you know, these things escalate relatively quick because of one's perception of someone as being a threat or being criminal or having criminal intent when it's the same guy. And I can suggest to you his personality didn't change because his clothing changed. All right, any comments before I move on? All right, let's take an instant association quiz. Here's what I want you guys to do. I want you guys to pull out a piece of paper and a pen, and I'm going to say some things really quick. And I want you to I want you to write down the first type of person that comes to mind: white male, female, Hispanic, black, whatever you think of. The first type of person that comes to mind. We're going to do this relatively quick, and we're going to have a little bit of discussion about your answers. Now, in a scientific environment, when they do an implicit association quiz, they'll give you a little thing that you push a button relatively quick. They'll set up the parameters, and they'll say, when you see this photo, if you think this, push the button really quick, right? And they're gauging and measuring the quickness in which you push the button and your implicit response to whatever they presented you with, whatever photo they presented you with. We're doing the same thing, but we're doing it in a less expensive way. So as I call out these things, I want you to write down the first thing that comes to mind, okay? Here we go. First type of person that comes to mind. What type of person comes to mind when you hear government? What type of person comes to mind when you hear CEO? What type of person comes to mind when you hear medical doctor? What type of person comes to mind when you hear law enforcement? What type of person comes to mind when you hear urban? What type of person comes to mind when you hear suburban? What type of person comes to mind when you hear subsidized housing? And what type of person comes to mind right away when you hear drug dealer? All right, so let's talk about your responses very quickly. What do we have for government? What type of person comes to mind when you hear government?
White male.
White male.
White male, white male. What else?
White male.
Black male, okay. What about CEO?
White male.
White male.
White male, okay. What about medical doctor?
White male.
White male.
Black female.
White female, black female, what else? It has to change a little bit when we get to medical doctor. What about law enforcement?
White male.
Black male.
Black male. That was Tamika, no doubt, right?
Oh, I said white male.
Oh, okay. right.
Margaret said black male.
All right. What about urban?
Black.
Black youth.
All right. What about suburbs?
White.
White women.
White
Anybody say black? All right. So.
White families.
Huh?
White families.
White families. All right. Of the African Americans on the sample group of the target group here, who lives in the suburbs? Tamika, you live in the suburbs?
I'm in a rural city, but I am maybe I think it's 2 black families that live on my street. And for the first 10 years we lived there, we were the only black family that lived on my street. So
you would consider your community to be suburban, rural kind of, right?
Correct.
And you said, when I said suburbs, you said black?
Oh, no, I said white.
Right. So you're black, and you don't instantly associate black with the suburbs, even though you live there. Here's the point. The point is this, that because we don't associate black faces with certain communities, we could be George Zimmerman. We could see black kids congregating in our community, even though we're black, and we can go, whoa, what are they up to? Wow, that's strange, because our instant association with our suburban neighborhood, even though we're black, is not black kids. And so we could possibly take a double take, or maybe for an instant think that something is remiss, something is suspicious, because that's not our instant association, right? So it's not just white people, even some black people who live in the suburbs don't instantly associate black faces with their communities. And so they could have the same type of suspicious reaction to a group of black kids walking down the street. What about subsidized housing? Anybody say white males? No.
No.
What do we get for subsidized housing?
Low income.
Low income?
Yeah.
Yeah. What about drug dealers?
To both.
That's applicable to what now?
That's applicable to both white male, and black male, because I put both because it depends on their social economic status.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. Yeah. What about drug dealers?
Black male.
Yeah.
Black male, youth, what else?
Teenagers.
Black teenagers. Anybody say medical doctors?
No.
No. Oh. But we do realize that in the opioid crisis that we're currently, the opioid epidemic we're currently dealing with, that in some cases the drug dealer is a physician, right? Mm-hmm. The guy who gave Michael Jackson that fatal dose, I think it was fentanyl, was his drug dealer. He had no medical reasons to be taking that drug, and yet he was being prescribed that drug. And they put his drug dealer on trial, right? And so one of the things we're seeing in this opioid epidemic that we're experiencing is we don't have a clear drug dealer identified, not in the way that we did during the crack cocaine era, right? They were very clear, the media was very clear in vilifying my brothers standing on street corners selling crack cocaine to medicate people's pain. And yet we have the same thing occurring in doctors' offices all across this country. And yet it's prescription drugs, not the writers of those prescriptions, right, that is causing this epidemic, right? So terminology is key, right? Thank you all. So as Jill take over this particular video, we got 2 coming up. I want us to have some conversation about what we see in this video. So I want Jill to cue this up, play it, and we'll have some conversation, and then we'll play another video.
Pastor Palmer. I can't hear you.
Sorry. I'm sorry, guys. 13 is correct. I had to mute my mic for the video, but I forgot to unmute. Yeah, you're right. 13 was correct. How many of you guys saw a moonwalking bear? I saw the dancing bear. Yeah, I saw it. Anybody else? How many folks? Yeah. All right. Yes, yes. Nope. Nope. Yes. Megan. All right, good. So a few people saw it. Many people didn't see it. Megan, let's have a conversation. So, Megan, I see where you said you didn't see it. Why do you think you missed it? Did I get that name right? Megan, are you there?
Megan is unable to unmute.
Oh, okay. Somebody in our control group that didn't see it, talk to me. Tell me who didn't see it. Did you see it? Sharon, did you see it?
No, I did not see it. I want to see the video again. I can't believe I didn't see it. I did not see it. I was so focused on the people in white that I wasn't looking at anybody but the people in white throwing the ball back and forth to each other.
Oh, Sharon, you're going to have to help me out. I'm
sorry.
Sharon, you got to help me out. Why were you so focused on the people in white?
Because didn't I count how many times you see the team in white pass the ball? Wasn't that the instruction?
That's exactly what the video messaged you to do. It messaged you. Remember, we said these predispositions we have to see things a certain way has to do with messaging. So here we are. This video says, watch the kid in white t-shirt. And that's exactly what you did. Yep. And you may have missed an obvious fact that many others saw, right?
Mm-hmm.
So Sharon says she wants to see the video. Anybody else didn't see it?
Didn't see it.
Didn't see it?
I didn't see it.
Wow. Well, let's see if it's there. Jill, let's play the video again. All right, I want you guys to pay attention this time. Sharon, are you there? I want to talk to you.
I'm here. I cannot believe I did not see that guy.
You didn't see him, Sharon?
No, I did this time, but I'm like, how did I miss him? I was so focused on the.
Why do you think you saw him the second time, Sharon?
Because I was looking for him.
Well, why were you looking for him the second time?
Because I didn't believe he was actually there, and I had to convince myself that he was. You just had to show me. You had to convince me that he was there because I was really convinced that he wasn't there. So I was very focused on seeing him and making certain that I saw him if he was there, and he was there.
Wow. You think it's possible, Sharon, that we could have a conversation about some of the families we respond to in these very stereotypic and biased ways? We had a conversation about the potential of these kids, the possibility of these families. We could probably see something in them we didn't see without that conversation. Because that's really all we did, was predispose you to see what we wanted you to see by giving you a message. You saw it exactly how we intended you to see it. And then we paused the video and we had a conversation about something you missed, about a fact that was there all along. And when you saw that fact vivid and right in front of you, you went, oh my goodness, how did I miss that? You missed it because you were not looking for it. It's very easy to see exactly what you're looking for, and it's very easy to miss what you're not looking for. All we did was pause the video, had a conversation about the presence of something else, and you looked at the same scenario same group of people, and guess what you saw? Something different and something so obvious, right? Imagine what would happen if we would pause the video on all of that messaging we got about those people over there, about those people like that, and we actually thought about their futures the way we think about the futures of these kids from this good side of town and these good families and these good neighborhoods. Imagine if we thought about the kids from the other neighborhoods the same way. Pause the video and actually begin to look at their lives differently. Maybe we'll see some obvious things about them that we miss time and time again as we judge them through our bias. Wow. Thank you,
That's powerful.
Sharon.
Powerful.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I thought so too. Thank you for being very helpful. One of the things that predisposes us to favoring some over others is this thing called affinity bias. We all have them, right? There's affinity bias deals with this tendency we have to prefer or accept other people who are similar to ourselves, right? This bias towards individuals who make us feel good to be around. Affinity bias, however, makes diversity and inclusion difficult to achieve because, again, I quickly affirm and like being around people who are similar to me. Sometimes they're similar to me in socioeconomics. They're similar to me in educational achievement. They're similar to me in community makeup. Even though they may be very similar to me in race, they're so dissimilar to me in a lot of other ways. And so sometimes I could have a affinity bias towards people like me who actually may be of a different race or ethnicity, and have a bias against individuals who are like me racially, but different in socioeconomics and education and community construct, and so on and so forth. So affinity bias is very important because we do typically lean to. So if you're in a decision-making role as it relates to hiring, I can't tell you how many times organizations will call me in, we'll have the diversity and inclusion conversation, and they'll talk about how much they value inclusion, and yet they keep hiring people who look like them, right? And I remember talking with a lady one time about bringing me into her organization, and she said, we really value diversity and inclusion. We've been talking about this for years, and we've been working towards racial equity initiatives. And I said, so tell me about your organization. She said, well, it's probably 99% white female. And I looked at her like, wow. So why is it that you value diversity and inclusion so much, and yet you can't achieve diversity? And it's because of affinity bias. We keep hiring the people we feel comfortable with. They just happen to look like us. And then availability bias, I'm going to sum this up. Availability bias is simply scenarios and situations that are available in the instant judgment-making process, right? This tendency we have to projected examples into actual occurrences, right? So I see something on the news, and then I'm having a situation right now, and that availability of that news report the night before now enables me to see this actual occurrence similar, and now I start to judge it in similar ways, right? Availability bias refers to relying heavily on those things that are most memorable, such as news programming. Three things that influence our availability biases that is important is, first of all, our personal observation, right? We saw something, and now that occurrence becomes an availability bias. We refer to it unconsciously sometimes in certain scenarios. Polarizing events, right? So black people, every time we see a black person, whether it's on social media or a news station, being murdered or beaten by police, we have these availability bias that makes us afraid when we encounter the police, right? And it's because of that polarizing event, right? And then personal experience, something happened to me, right? And so now, because I got assaulted one time in the parking lot, now I'm very biased towards men in parking lots, right? Every man in the parking lot is a threat, and you won't be able to talk me down because I had a personal experience, and that personal experience is becomes an availability bias. It avails me to a scenario that is not necessarily actually occurring, right? Any comments or thoughts? So here's when our implicit racial bias is most likely to thrive. In environments where we're cognitively taxed, our biases kind of take the leadership role in our psyche, right? When we have complex decisions to make under time pressure, we lean on our biases more than we should. When the information we have is imperfect, we already said that our bias, those mental shortcuts, do what? Fill in missing information, right? And when the decision makers are cognitively depleted, anxious, or distracted. When I went to Georgetown University to start my fellowship project with them and go through my racial and ethnic disparity certification program, one of the presenters, one of the professors presented us with some research where they looked at judicial sentencing. And they had a couple of variables they to consider. One is the time of day, right? So as the day drug on, the longer the day went, the more punitive the judge got. Another variable they looked at was whether or not the judge had something that they were anxious about, maybe something going on in their personal life, right? They were more punitive when they had distractions and personal issues going on. Another thing they looked at is whether or not they were anxious or cognitively depleted, or the lack of breaks and a full lunch. So if a judge wasn't able to take lunch and they didn't have adequate breaks, they had a large docket, they would tend to get more punitive towards as the day wore on than they were at the beginning of the day. What this simply says to me is when the decision maker is having a bad day, their biases are going to be in full force and affecting their decisions. That bad day is going to be experienced by every person or many of the people they have to make a decision about. And then when the tasks are complex and the decisions are difficult, our bias influences us.
Pastor Palmer?
Yes, ma'am.
This may be a good time to just interject some information,
yes.
Circling back to the Child and Adolescent Needs and Strengths Assessment, the CANS. That there was a question around the appropriateness for Black persons. So we did receive some clarification from a trainer, Carrie, that CANS was evaluated for racial bias, and it was concluded it can be used for all populations.
Okay, good. Yep. All right, good point to make. All right. So if we feel strong in that evaluation, then we still have to look at, if there are serious, we know there's disproportionality, but is there a disparity in the tool? And so the tool itself may not necessarily reveal bias, but if there is discretion in the responses and how they are recorded on the tool, then perhaps the bias may be in the person actually conducting the assessment. So that would be where I would most likely look at next if the tool itself has been validated and has been cleared of having bias into it. So good point to be made. These blind spots, these implicit reactions that we have to people often cause us to do a few things. One is to make opinions about their home environment, right? We do that sometimes in our work, is we make assumptions about people's home life, because they live in certain communities, or maybe they come from a single parent home and we think a single parent home means a home without a father. And that's actually not the case in many cases, especially in the Black community. Many fathers, even though they're not able to maintain a living relationship with the mother of their children, are very much engaged with their children's lives. And so oftentimes we make the opinion that if mom's raising the kids alone, that there's no father in the kid's life. And sometimes that opinion is not correct. We evaluate behavior oftentimes through that blind spot, right? And so sometimes somebody referred to the early childhood development data around early childhood centers and things like that. and how African American kids are disproportionately receive disciplinary actions in some of those settings. The learning expectations, and so we've seen this, especially in early childhood development, where the expectations of certain kids is not as high as it is for other kids, right? So the kid who comes from a certain demographic of folks in a certain community, we don't really expect as much. But a kid who comes from a dual parent home, an affluent home with affluent parents, we expect better. We expect better accomplishments out of those students. Tamir Rice was an example of this blind spot, right? The estimation of his age and his size, right? He was not 175 pounds at 12 years old, and he did not look like he was 18 years old, and yet that's how some initially described him. And so when the police arrived, they were expecting to see a man with a gun. Instead, they encountered a child with a toy gun, and he was shot and killed on the playground. The need for harsher discipline, right? And so we have seen where, and we've actually had some of our diversion workers call this to the attention of some of our county attorneys, where they've seen a Caucasian kid weeks earlier get one response, and then a black kid comes along with same charge, similar charge, and a similar situation, no prior record, and yet the prosecutor is pushing for a more punitive reaction. And they've actually called them on and say, hey, you do realize, maybe you don't realize this. 2 weeks ago, we had a white kid who had the same charges, and he had no priors, and you did this. And so maybe you're not aware that you're about to punish this kid far worse than you did that kid. And oftentimes the prosecutor responded with, no, I did not realize that. Let's get this kid the same diversion opportunity, right? And so sometimes we have to help people realize that they are being more punitive in certain scenarios than other scenarios. We've seen cases in the U.S. where black and white were involved in the same crime, just like you see here in this picture, co-defendants. And black kids got worse sentence than the white kids. And so very important that we recognize this particular piece. So here's the good news. The good news is the bias habit can be broken. Starts with being aware of one's own bias. Starts with being concerned, acknowledging and being concerned about the consequences of bias, right? That data that we saw earlier, we need to be concerned about that. That's not a fair reflection of the professionals who work in your organization, right? And so we have to be concerned with that. We have to learn to replace bias responses with non-bias responses, and we'll talk about that a little bit further in detail here in a minute. And then we have to learn to counter our biases and not deny them, right? It's okay that we react and we have these implicit reactions to people, but we have to acknowledge them. We have to learn to counter them and not deny them. So counter stereotypic replacement, right? Stereotype replacement, right? That could be me, Christy, in the elevator with you. And there I am feeling uncomfortable, having that panic attack, wanting to get out of here, and you clutching your purse in the back, and I'm thinking, oh, she's about to accuse me of something. I had to think about that. I had to think about that reaction I had when trapped in an elevator with the white woman. And then I had to reflect upon that reaction. Why am I responding this way? Why do I feel so threatened just by being in the elevator with this individual? And then I have to alter that response, right? I have to be very intentional in settling myself down, engaging Christy in a conversation, and kind of realizing that there's no threat here, right? So think about how I think in these scenarios and respond very intentional in altering my responses. And then counter stereotypic imaging, right? Recognize the assumptions that we make based on appearance, right? Some kids we see and we automatically can look at them and go, this is a bad kid, right? Recognize that assumption, right? Maybe it's because he has dreads. Maybe it's because he has his hair in braids. Maybe it's because he's wearing baggy clothes. Maybe it's because he has a tattoo or two or body piercings, right? Recognize those assumptions and then convert that image into a non-stereotypic group. In other words, let's imagine these kids from this community that we typically think are bad kids. Let's imagine them with the same futures that we automatically see when we get a kid whose parent is a judge, his other parent is a doctor, and he's on his way to Harvard, and we don't want to mess up his future. Well, let's imagine this kid over here has a future too. Let's imagine that we don't want to mess up his future, right? Because sometimes they're charged with similar charges, right? They're similarly situated, but this kid has a whole lot of future that we need to protect. We don't need to let this mistake mess up his opportunity to get into an Ivy League college. This kid over here, we don't even expect to get out of high school. So we need to put him deeper into the system. No, let's reimagine this kid's future for him, right? Counter stereotypic imaging. And then perspective taking, increasing that psychological closeness to stigmatized groups, right? I love what the tennis shoes say, right? Take a walk in my shoes before you judge me. Understand the groups that you serve. Understand the communities and the people that you serve, right? And that requires very intentional contact and communication. That's difficult at times. And then individualization, right? Learn to evaluate members of a group based on their individual attributes, based on their personal attributes, not group attributes. Don't deal with individuals in the group context. Well, you know, he's from this community. He's got the tattoos of this gang. You know, he's typical. And so let's do what we always do to these people, right? No, treat him as an individual. Is he a good kid? Has he gotten caught up with the wrong crowd? Is his gang involvement a part of survival, right? Some folks don't understand that. Growing up in the inner city, you know, you either join the gang and be protected by the gang, or you refuse to join the gang and get victimized by the gang. And so how do we realize which is which, right? And so learn to evaluate individuals based on those individual attributes and not those group attributes. And then increase opportunity for positive contact, right? Seek those opportunities to have positive interactions with folks that are not a part of your group, right? And again, all of these reactions require a level of intentionality. They're difficult because I'm more comfortable with people who are similar, right? And so it's difficult to really start to challenge and push back on some of my reactions to people who are not like me, who come from a different community, who dress differently, who talk differently. And so the intentionality piece is important. And then avoid using demographics to define all the people in a given community. I don't know too many communities that don't have a good side and a bad side. And sometimes we hear about the things happening on that side of town, in that housing development or complex, and we start to summarize everybody the same. We start to view and see everybody the same. And so we have clients in front of us from a particular community or a particular housing complex, and we're responding to those facts, right, where they live and where they come from. And so avoid using demographics to define all the people in a given community. And then think about what a self-reflection inquiry would look like, right? If Judge Calloway was on the call, I would ask her, what kind of processes she goes through. But I suggest to judges sometimes, I have conversations with judges here in Kentucky, sometimes on one-on-one, they'll call me up and say, hey, let's talk, right? And one judge sent me an email one time and said, I really want to understand the people I see most in my courtroom, young black males. And it's hard for me being a white, middle-aged white man, wealthy and affluent, to really connect to these African-American men that I have to judge. And so we talk about what that self-reflection inquiry may look like. Am I responding to cultural attire? Am I responding to the inability to speak clear English? or to command the English language? Am I responding to the lack of ability to speak English in its entirety, right? Am I responding to race, ethnicity? Am I responding to certain cultural items, right? Some school districts have tried to outlaw, they have discipline policies against kids wearing dreadlocks, right? They don't realize the cultural implications of how some kids wear their hair. And so we have to have that self-reflection inquiry, memorize it, know how to walk yourself through an internal conversation about, am I responding to this person based on biases within myself, whether it's her race, the way she talks, the head wrap, the cultural garb. After 9/11, every time we saw a Muslim, we panicked, right? There were all kinds of mistreatment of Muslim people across this country in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, right? And we were having these biased reactions to folks. Any comments in the comment room, in the chat room?
Pastor Palmer, this is Judge Calloway.
Hey, Judge.
And I am here, and definitely thought about a lot what you were talking about. And it's a work in progress. I mean, when you have a child in front of you who is speaking, who's speaking a way that you would not expect them to speak in the courtroom, it's sometimes very difficult not to judge them by what they're saying or how they're saying what they're saying, and to definitely put aside any of the biases that I'm thinking about. It's something that I have been working on since I've been on the bench, and have been working with all of my magistrates, that we got to take people as they are, and that when they're coming into the courtroom, we can't expect them to be able to speak the way that we want them to speak, and that we have to accept who they are and not judge them for that. And
right.
So it's a work in progress.
Yeah. So, Judge, it sounds like you've already started to build within your own psyche this de-biasing checklist. Like, am I really responding to the way this individual is talking with all the hand gestures and all the slang? Am I about to react to this and slam this kid? Or am I listening to the content of what he's trying to say and not the method in which he's saying it? So you're right, Judge. You have to really work through some things to not respond and react to some of that behaviors.
Absolutely. And it's a full courtroom effort, because, a lot of times our court officers will stand up when they hear someone who they think might be speaking disrespectfully. And
right.
That triggers a whole nother level. And so, we got to talk to them about, it's important to de-escalate. It's important to sometimes just let people vent and let them talk. If they, if they need to cuss me out, let them cuss me out. That doesn't change what the ruling should be, nor it should change how we're responding to them. So it's a court-wide effort that we constantly try to make sure that we're doing better.
Yeah, and I think, Judge, to that end, I think we have to realize that, there are a whole bunch of other things at play when it comes to minorities in the courtroom, just dealing with authority and the institutions. And a lot of times we're looking at what's happening right now, but you don't know how many times this family has felt victimized by the system. And it doesn't matter that you're black, you're still the system. And so my anger and my response right now is against the system, and it just happens to be that you're the representative of the system. And oftentimes the system is not ready to really look at, over time, what has been done to this community and the people who come before the court. And sometimes they bring that frustration into that courtroom. And so, Judge, kudos to you for having that frame of mind that says, you know what, I've got to get to the best possible outcome for every person that comes into the courtroom, regardless of how they communicate, the lack of communication skills, the way they're dressed, the way they behave. And you really have to work through a process within your own mind to get to that place where you're looking at this person and trying to create the same equitable outcomes you just seen happen with a family who basically came for the same reasons, but they were very respectful. They had a paid attorney. Everything was neat in a nice, neat package. It wasn't all this extra stuff you had to deal with. So, yes, I appreciate that comment. Let's talk about microaggressions. They come in three forms. I'm going to focus on micro insults, but microaggressions come in the form of micro invalidations, and that's where we seek to invalidate someone's experiences based on race and ethnicity. And I get that oftentimes when the last mayor we had, he and I had a very contentious relationship, and I would always talk about the Good Old Boys Network, and every time he heard that, he would say, Pastor Palmer, everything's not about race, it's not about race, and I would continue to point out using, of course, data and some of the behaviors within city government to say, yes, it is about race. And but he kept seeking to invalidate my perception and the experience of African Americans in our city. And so that's micro invalidations. And then there are micro assaults, which are just explicit things that we know we shouldn't say, and yet we say them. Most people don't live in that space. Micro insults, however, are verbal, nonverbal, environmental communications that convey rudeness and insensitivity. And oftentimes, they're not intentional, right? They demean a person's racial heritage or identity. And again, not intentionally at times, right? You see a woman who's Muslim and she's dressed in her traditional attire, and you make negative comments about how hot she must feel and how uncomfortable that looks. And if I was you, I wouldn't wear that in this kind of weather and things like that. That's very insensitive to her culture and to her traditions, right? Asking someone questions about their ability to hold specific qualifications or a specific position, right? Like, you know, I want to see the man in charge, and the person in charge happens to be a woman, and you keep denying the fact that she could actually be the person in charge, right? Here's some examples of microaggressions. What are you? I've been asked that before. A lady walked up to me at the break in one of my trainings, and she said, "What are you?" And you speak English very well, or you're very articulate. What do your people think about that? You're really pretty for someone so dark. Your name is too hard to pronounce, so I'll just call you Mary. Why do you sound so white? You don't act like a normal black person. I've had that one before as well. You're not like other Muslim people. Where are you from? Where are you really from? No, where are you really, really from? Right? These are examples of microaggressions. Anybody got any other examples where you've seen or heard microaggressions in the workplace? All right, here's an example. And these individuals were all arrested in Iowa for the same offense. And yet the black suspects got their mug shots and the white suspects got their yearbook photos. This is how the Iowa newspaper displayed them, right? They got their mug shots and they got their yearbook posters, right? This next one will be clear in the next video. As you get that one ready for us, Jill, you can switch over if you want. But the video, the billboard with the dark figure and the negative message, Big Brother's watching you, compared to the light, fair-skinned figure with a very positive message. I can see clear, right? I can see clearly, right? And so these things have an impact. And this next video really shows why these microaggressions impact and affect our children. So let's have some conversation on the backside of this video. 15 out of the 21 children preferred the white doll. This video is long. It goes for about 14 minutes. But what they do is they do different segments of kids: black kids, white kids, Hispanic kids, Asian kids. They talk with different groups of kids. And what we find is that all the groups respond in similar ways. They all prefer the white doll over the black doll, right? And so I apologize, Gayla, Michelle, and others that said this video was difficult to watch. The first time I watched it, I cried as well, especially when they did the self-identification piece and asked kids to which doll looked like you. And you saw in the second segment where the girl attempted to push the white doll forward a couple of times. This says a lot about society and how those associations with dark-skinned people with black or dark colors in negative connotations impact the psyche of our children. So when I was in Western Kentucky, one of our senators, his wife, Senator Whitney Westerfield, down there in Christian County, right next to Clarksville, Tennessee. His wife was in one of my trainings, and she said that after the training, she said, Pastor Mom, I had an incident in school the other day, and I really would like some advice as to how to deal with this. Senator Westerfield is a white Republican, and he has a Caucasian wife. They have 2 African-American children that they're raising. One they adopted and one through vitro. And every daughter was in kindergarten. And every day, at the end of the day, the teacher would give the kids a picture. And they would say, you can paint this picture in your favorite color today. Whatever your favorite color is today, you can paint the picture. So they may get a picture of an elephant, and it didn't matter. If your favorite color was pink, it'd be a pink elephant. If your favorite color was yellow, it'd be a yellow elephant. This particular day, they gave her daughter a picture, and she painted it in her favorite color. Her favorite color that day was black. When she gave it to her teacher gave it back to her and said, here's another picture. Go pick a prettier color. And Senator Whitney Westerfield's wife said, I don't know how to deal with this particular teacher. I don't know what to say. And we had a conversation about how she should respond and react. But the reality was what did that say to that kid? Pick a prettier color. Because whatever the picture was, it didn't matter. Black was not a pretty color. Dr. Cherie Dawson Edwards, a professor at the University of Louisville, a good friend of mine, she's a black woman, and she takes her children on these very intentional African-American heritage trips across the country. In 2018, she went to Washington, D.C., and they visited the Smithsonian Museum of African-American History and Culture. These are the original dolls from the 1950s doll test. And here's what she writes. I'm still processing this, but the most disturbing thing at the museum today is me asking my daughter which doll she liked best. It's 2018. She chose the white one. I mean, both of them aren't the cutest, but still. And she had her baby with her who almost looks dead like the black baby. Baby goes everywhere. She's her favorite. So why did she choose the white one or the other one? Why did she choose the other one? I'm sorry, I forgot to ask. Are there any comments about the video? Anybody had anything they wanted to add about the video as they watched that video?
I have some comments that they agree these children are surrounded daily by negative messages, that it was difficult to watch.
Yeah. Here's one of those. Well, let me get through this one, and I'll give you an example of what could facilitate that kind of reaction to kids, besides media and television programming. This is the Baby Alive box. When Layla was 3.5 years old, we bought our Baby Alive. We bought her the one on the right, which to us looked like a biracial version. She found the box in the closet and brought it to my wife, and she demanded the one on the left, the white one. And when my wife asked her, because Layla had been bragging about her doll and how precious her doll was and how pretty her doll was, until she found the box. And when my wife asked her why did she want the white one, the other one, Layla said because it's the prettiest. So she came to a conclusion that the white one was the prettiest, the one to be most desired. And so at 3.5, she was already processing skin tone. and in her mind, the white one was the one to have. And so this leads to microaggressions in everyday society. So my wife called me one day and she said, baby, she says, all the dolls in Walmart, all the black dolls in Walmart have been marked down and placed in clearance. So I left the office and went to Walmart to figure out why, what was going on. And sure enough, all the dolls, all the black dolls have been marked down and placed on clearance. Now, I want you to understand this. Clearance was not in the toy section. It was over in the lawn and garden, between the mulch and the fertilizer, on a non-tiled floor. It's kind of gritty. And all the dolls that had come in the black version were marked down and moved to the lawn and garden. And this was immediately a few days after Halloween. And I thought that was interesting because we're entering the Christmas shopping season, and yet all of these black baby dolls have been marked down. My particular city is about 20% or better African American. And so I did my research. I looked on Walmart.com that particular day, and they were not marked down. I went to the Walmart in Franklin County, which is near our state capital, predominantly white community. They were not marked down. I had my sister-in-law to check in Chicago, a couple of Walmarts, to see if Black Lovabella was marked down, and they were not marked down. It was a local decision. Why, I don't know. And not only was it a local decision to mark these dolls down, but to move them to the lawn and garden, forcing those of us who would prefer to buy a black doll to now go to a marginalized doll community, a doll community that does not reflect the toy aisle and the toy community. And now here we are over in dimly lit lawn and garden on a gritty floor, looking through black dolls who have been shoved between the mulch and the fertilizer. So that day, white Lovabella, was in the toy aisle with all of his bright lights and accessories and bright colors, where all the kids go to have fun and be happy, for $97. And the black version was over in lawn and garden, dimly lit, gritty floor, no tile, between the mulch and the fertilizer, where kids rarely go to get excited and have fun, for $25. That day, Barbie was $19.88 in the toy aisle, and the black Barbie was over in the lawn and garden between the mulch and the fertilizer for $5. That day, My Life for $27.97, the white one on the toy aisle, with all the other nice toys and toy accessories in the bright lights and tiled floor, for $27.97. And there, his black counterpart was in the lawn and garden on the gray shelf and not the bright white one, between the mulch and the fertilizer and the gritty floor and the dim lights for $7. So the next day, in my righteous indignation, I went into the Walmart and I bought all the black baby dolls. That was 3 years ago, and I since then still buy black baby dolls to give away at the end of every training. And we have reached the end of my training, and therefore I'm going to give this black baby doll away. And I think we have selected the winner, and that is the person who was the first registrant for the conference. So if you have the name, Miss Wright, you can unmute and announce the winner of the black baby doll. And I bought all these dolls and started giving them away because I know that their creator, whoever the doll creator is, their creator created them equal. And he gave them the same functionality, same ability, and he gave them the same potential to make some little kid very happy. And the only thing he made different about them was their skin tone. And when they hit society, society devalued the darker ones and relocated them to a marginalized community, segregated them in the lawn and garden that didn't look as nice. Who takes their child to the lawn and garden to shop for toys, right? They had no idea culturally, racially, how this looked until the next day when I walked in and bought all the black dolls. And of course, when somebody asked me, why am I buying so many black dolls, of course, I took the moment to educate some folks about the microaggression that I felt in the way they marked down the black dogs and relocated them. And it's been about 3 years since this occurred, and I've not seen that practice ever again in our Walmart. So, Ms. Wright, are you still with us? Do you know who the first registrant is so we can announce our winner?
Yes, the first registrant is Kate Trudell.
Kate Trudell.
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 No, the D. Trudell.
Okay, Trudell.
Yes.
Kate, are you still with us? She probably can't unmute, but if you'll send Gwendolyn Wright your information, she'll get your mailing address back to me, and I'll make sure that you get your black baby doll. I only ask that you give her a nice home and a nice child to play with and a nice name. Thank you guys for being a part of this experience. I hope that the training has been impactful. I hope that you walk away with some challenges within yourself. And I hope that you bring some of those same challenges to the organizations and systems in which you work. And hopefully we can make things better for all kids and families. Thank you all. I'll turn it back over to Christy.
Yes. Thank you, Pastor Palmer, for that phenomenal presentation. It truly was impactful. On behalf of all the regional coordinators, we'd like to thank you for joining us today and engaging in this timely and enlightening presentation. If you did not get an answer to your specific question or comment, please let us know, and we will do our best to get those questions to Pastor Palmer for answers. All recordings will be available on our TCCY website, tn.gov/TCCY. Under the Publications tab, click on Webinars. As a reminder, if you're calling in, if you're just calling in, not with the computer and the phone, but just call in, and you need a CEU certificate or a certificate of participation, please email Gwendolyn Wright, GWENDOLYN your name and request for either a CEU or participation certificate. All attendees will be receiving an email next week with certificates and membership information about joining our local councils. So again, thank you all so much for joining us today.
Christy, one correction. It's Gwendolyn.Wright. You left out the dot at tn.gov. Thank you.
Thank you, Gwen.
All righty. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you all so much.
Bye, Pastor Palmer.
Bye.
Thank you, guys.
Galloway.
Thanks, Jill. Jill, you were great.
Sorry about
and Gwen, if you'll give me a call, I appreciate it. Hey, thanks, Judge. Hopefully we'll see you soon.
Yes, and hopefully
right.
next time I can hear you and I won't be in trial, so I can stay the whole time.
And hopefully this COVID will leave and we'll be in person.
Yes.
Good.
That'll be a blessing.
Yes, it will be.
There in Kentucky now.
Yes. All right then.
Bye, guys. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Hi, Pastor Palmer. I'm Melissa, and I work with TCCY, but I was born at Chickasaba Hospital in Blytheville, Arkansas.
Wow. Let me remove this box so I can see your face. Chickasaba in the house.
Plaza 89 right here.
I was born in 1963.
Oh, you're just a few years ahead of me. That's all.
Yeah.
I just wanted to say, hey, that when you said that, I about fell out of my chair.
Wow. Yeah, that's where I was born, Chickasaba Hospital.
Hey, 18 years of my life, and then I got out.
Wow. I'm going to have to tell somebody I met somebody else that was born in that hospital.
Thank you.
Wow.
Thank you very much.
Take care.
You too. It was great.
All right. Bye-bye. Thanks again, Jill. You were amazing.